Welcome to the Teach-In Network's Teach-In on Foreign Policy. My name is Ryan Black, and I'm the organizing coordinator at RootsAction. We are live and recording, and we'll have this video posted to share tomorrow on the RootsAction YouTube, so be on the lookout for that. Thank you to everyone who is joining us now, and to our speakers, who I will introduce shortly. Our theme for tonight's Teach-In is foreign policy. And if you're here, you probably understand that U.S. foreign policy under both parties is a disaster. It is critical now more than ever, with pro-war Democrats on their way out and pro-war Republicans on their way in, that we educate our communities, our friends, our social groups about U.S. foreign policy, where it is now, how it is destructive abroad and how it hurts us domestically, and where it could be if we put peace and people ahead of profits and power. And we need your help to do that. The Teach-In Network is here to serve activists and organizers. To do that, we will connect you and your local group or campus group with expert speakers for your own event, your own Teach-In. It's that simple. We'll help as much as you want us to. We won't force you to do anything. We won't force you to say anything or include anything. We want to connect amazing speakers like the ones we have here tonight with organizations, local activists, campus groups, and anyone who is interested in educating their communities. If you're not sure where to start, that's okay. I'm going to share my screen here. If you are not sure where to start, that's okay. You can go to the teachinnetwork.org, and we have all sorts of resources. If you go to under About, we have How to Organize a Teach-In, which will give you the basics of how to organize a Teach-In, from the planning process to promoting it to actually organizing it and creating an agenda, what to do while you're hosting it. And then another important thing is what to do afterwards, after the Teach-In. How do you follow up? How do you get feedback? What do you do with that data? Do you send emails? Most people who haven't organized a Teach-In or any kind of organizing event will still want some guidance, though. Just, a walkthrough probably isn't enough. So you can go to About and get help organizing. And right here we have a form where you can fill it out, give us your information, tell us a little bit about what you're trying to do, what you want to do, and we will get you started. If you're already an organization that's got membership and you're organizing, you're doing your thing, you can go straight to our speakers page and you can just find a speaker for your event and you can request that we connect you with them. We have dozens of incredible speakers. So we just really encourage you, get on the Teach-In Network website, teachinnetwork.org, explore it, look at all the resources. We have these incredible toolboxes. This one on Gaza, we did our Gaza Teach-In a couple weeks ago, about a month ago, with just, primers, presentations, videos, resources, social media accounts, articles. There's so much stuff on here. And then the speakers are obviously the most important part, and we have a ton of those. With that, we can get started. Tonight we will be joined by David Vine, author of Base Nation, Island of Shame, and the United States of War; Chris Appy, director of the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy and author of American Reckoning; Sonali Kolhatkar, journalist and author of Rising Up, The Power of Narrative in Pursuing Racial Justice, and co-author of Bleeding Afghanistan; and Emma Claire Foley, diffuse nuclear war leader and RootsAction nuclear specialist; and of course, David Swanson, executive director of World Beyond War and campaign coordinator at RootsAction and author of War is a Lie. So with that, we will let David Swanson go ahead and kick things off for us. David is going to give a general overview of foreign policy, and talk about whatever he wants foreign policy-wise. David, go ahead and kick it off for us.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Great to be here at the Teach-In. I'm going to share screen. What I was asked to talk about was this primer on foreign policy that RootsAction published some years back, and that we have updated and continued using the past few years. And the idea was actually to interject some discussion and some understanding of foreign policy into the people who do the foreign policy. We talk to so many incumbent Congress members and candidates for Congress who claimed not to know about foreign policy, not to have a good position on this issue because they don't know anything about it, don't feel it's their business, literally think it's not part of the job, or it's not for the House, it's for the Senate. I watched a video on social media today of Medea Benjamin questioning Congress members how they voted on sanctioning the ICC. And pretty clearly, some of them don't even know what the ICC is. I mean, so the ignorance is not completely fake, but it's largely fake, of course, because what they're hiding in having campaign websites, the vast majority of which don't mention the existence of foreign policy at all, is very unpopular positions. Peace is very popular, war is not. And the parties in Washington, D.C. have become a pair of enthusiastic war parties. Norman Solomon of RootsAction wrote a good article last month on the Democratic Party becoming a war party, and Matt Duss today in The Guardian, perhaps a little hypocritically given his own past, same critique. You've become an unpopular war party. So we created this primer as a tool for educating candidates and Congress members and being able to go back to them and say, now you're educated, what's your position? But it's a good tool for educating anybody else as well. It's very, very strange for Congress members to pretend to know nothing about and have nothing to do with foreign policy, because it's basically what Congress is for. It's the majority of what Congress does. It's not the majority of all spending, but it's a strong majority of discretionary spending, of the spending that Congress members have anything to do with, what they spend their jobs deciding what to do with each year. And it's likely to become much more. Joe Biden was demanding that NATO members spend 2% of their economy on military, and Trump had this new number of 3%. Now Trump says 5%. And some Congress members say 7%. And there's no logic to it. Somebody's going to say 9 or 10% tomorrow. There's no reason they won't. And the reason we go through all this in the primer, but the reason they don't like to talk about how many dollars it is, or what percentage of government spending it is, or how many dollars per capita it is primarily because then if you compare U.S. military spending with other countries, it isn't even on the same chart. You have to roll out a whole, yards of paper to get the United States on the same graph with other countries. But if you talk about percentage of an economy, then you can talk about military spending shrinking even while it's growing and be in the same ballpark with some other countries. But to go from less than 3.5% to 5% or 7% of the U.S. economy, and especially if you take it away from the non-military spending, there's going to be very few people still buying the charade that the U.S. government is not principally a war machine with, some side affairs. Here's a bit of a comparison in terms of just weapons exports between the United States and other countries. The United States, exports more weapons to dictatorships and so-called democracies around the world than almost all the other countries put together. And you can say similar things about military spending per capita, about the size of military alliances and weapons customers and organizations like NATO, about bases, foreign military bases in other people's countries around the world. At least 70% of them are U.S. foreign bases. Other countries don't really do that with bases. The United States is going to take over Greenland. Well, the United States is already in Greenland. It's already got bases there. It's already got bases in every single country around Panama except Panama. This is the U.S. world. It's nothing like the military affairs of any other country ever before or now. How do I get it to go to another slide? There has to be a way. Oh, um, we put this in to be somewhat nice to Congress members, that give them a little bit of an excuse for how bad they are, but it is true that they are always lied to. The lies are quite blatant and obvious, and it's a choice to fall for them, but they are lies. Peace is very carefully avoided in Ukraine. Peace is very carefully avoided in Gaza, and they know this perfectly well. But they hear every day, as we hear on television, other stories. We know that the United States is fueling a war in Sudan, and we have the Secretary of State this week come out and denounce a genocide in Sudan, while taking a break from sending weapons to a genocide denounced by the rest of the world in Gaza. Favoring Al Qaeda is very bad in New Orleans, but perfectly good if you're taking over the country of Syria. So it's important to try to get Congress members, but also members of the public in general, to develop a little bit of healthy skepticism. What would be a decent foreign policy? What would be an actual defense department that actually defended anything from anything else? Well, you would invest money in something worthwhile. It's not much of a secret that you would move money from the war machine to environmental protection, human protection, instead of seeing, at least $50 billion damage thus far in California. You would have put that money into environmental protection before now, and you could have a Green New Deal beyond your wildest dreams. You could have a peace economy with education and infrastructure and retirement and health care for all, beyond what we dare dream of, if you took the money out of the counterproductive, destructive, immoral, illegal death machine. So there's my summary.
Thank you so much, David. Much appreciated as always. And we've sent that primer to all sorts of candidates, and only a couple of them have really appreciated it. And a lot of them have ignored us. But it's important they read that stuff. David, I do have a quick question for you, a little Q&A. You talk about going from 2 or 3% of GDP to 5% spending. That's what Trump wants all these other countries to do. Generally, does increased military spending lead to increased military using?
Yes, David Vine is an expert on the bases aspect of this, and I hope we'll hear from him shortly. But when you put more money into weapons and troops and bases and ships and planes and militarism, you get more wars. And the primary targets at risk in those wars are the bases that are supposedly defending against wars. It's such an upside down and evidence-free concept, but this notion that military spending isn't a sadistic evil to be cut back or eliminated, and isn't even a necessary evil based on supposed threats out there, but is a sort of public service. And the more of it, the better. And the richer a nation is, the more money it should put into it. And if you can dump 10% of your economy into weapons, how much better the world will be. Well, this is all based on the idea that the more you invest in war, the fewer wars you get. Whereas we have decade after decade of evidence of the exact opposite. Right? The more you invest in wars, the more momentum, the more profits to be made, the more the weapons have to be used up so you can manufacture new ones, the more they have to be tested, the more the threats and the hostility and the arms races and the mistakes and blunders and hurt egos are built up. You can't go putting weapons all around China, threatening China, and not understand that you're risking a war with China. It's basic common sense. A child can understand it, but a child hasn't been paid enough to not understand it.
Right. One more question. The Trump 2.0 administration, you asked Trump supporters, he was the peace candidate, and I don't think anyone's arguing that the Democrats were the peace candidates either. But there's all the talk about he's a peace candidate and start any more wars. He's going to get us out of all these wars. I don't think most of us believe that. But, we put this foreign policy primer together. We sent it all these candidates. Is there any of that peace stuff that you see coming from Trump at all, or is it a total mirage?
Well, people are much more interested in peace as random people and as voters than is led on by the corporate media. Peace is very, very popular and people are desperate. And so people will go looking for hints of peace anywhere they can get it. And someone like Trump will feed it to them, will say he's going to end the wars. We're going to have peace in Ukraine and Palestine before I even take office. And these are warmongers on the other side. His vice presidential candidate will say this stuff, even while they say the exact opposite stuff in the next breath. It's take what you want and don't hear the rest. But this is the guy who promised last time to end the war in Afghanistan, and then the general said no, and he saluted and didn't end the war in Afghanistan. This is the guy who openly threatened nuclear war, who supported military coups, who sent the weapons into Ukraine that even Obama, the guy hanging out there with him today in the National Cathedral wouldn't do because it risked creating a war. This is Mr. Kill Their Families. And this is the guy who wants to put 5% of everybody's economy, including the United States, into militarism. And he's not going to create peace in Ukraine. And his supposed master and loved one, Vladimir Putin, is saying, no, we're not going to simply end the war on your terms. He's not going to they're not negotiating peace in Gaza. They're playing with stupid journalists. That's all they're doing. And the danger is how many wars he could start, including in Iran. The danger is the use of the military to go after our friends and neighbors in this country because they came from Central America. If this is a peace candidate, my God, what have we been reduced to? I haven't seen a peace candidate out of these two parties in my lifetime.
Thank you very much, David. Always appreciated. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Emma Claire Foley, RootsAction nuclear weapons policy expert, writer, and filmmaker. Her commentaries have been featured in Newsweek, NBC, The Guardian, several other international outlets. Tonight, Emma Claire is going to speak about the pressing concerns of nuclear war and nuclear weapons. Emma Claire, take it away.
Thanks, Ryan, and David, and thanks everybody for being here. This is really inspiring already, and I'm happy to join. I'm going to just give an overview of kind of where I see nuclear weapons fitting into our foreign policy picture today, and why I think it's especially important to do teach-ins on nuclear weapons issue and how knowing and not knowing about nuclear weapons has been so integral to the way that they've been sort of pushed to the front of our foreign policy over nearly 8 decades. As I've sort of hinted at already, nuclear weapons are really deeply integrated into the conflicts that we're seeing across the world, that the United States is involved in various ways today. Even if they're not being used as weapons, they're used as justifications for non-nuclear military action. They're used as a way to kind of limit the possibilities, what's seen as possible or preferable in terms of how these conflicts might end or continue indefinitely, as it were. And what we've seen over and over is how having nuclear weapons isn't necessarily doesn't, from the perspective of nearly anyone, living in a nuclear weapons country like the United States, which together with Russia has about 90% of all the nuclear weapons existing in the world today, it doesn't, make people safer in any ways. And in fact, actually can create situations where war is even more destructive, enduring, and difficult to resolve. So I think that one thing that we hear constantly from the sort of nuclear weapons boosters in various, sectors of industry and government and elsewhere is the kind of necessity of nuclear weapons on an indefinite timeline, which I think is really important to point out as a safety measure, when in fact we need to redefine them as something that makes us profoundly unsafe. Um, we why is it sorry, uh trying to think where did I want to go next with this? So why is it especially important to do a teach-in on nuclear weapons? I'll go there. Um, the way the nuclear weapons establishment is set up is very much reliant upon non-knowledge by the public of the most basic facts about nuclear weapons. One really telling example I can think of is when diffuse nuclear war activists who regularly protest test launches of intercontinental ballistic missiles at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. We're waiting for months over the past few months for an announcement of a test, which usually comes only a few days before the test itself. And it was announced that it would take place on election night, right? So carefully and sort of obviously timed to happen when everyone's eyes were elsewhere, right? And where it could be passed off as this kind of inconsequential routine thing. So we see all the time, this is just one tiny example of a huge concerted effort to um, make nuclear weapons fade into the background. And when that's not possible, to present their maintenance and the expansion of nuclear arsenals that's ongoing seem like kind of a routine and necessary part of just, business as usual. And this has been really effective. I mean, a couple of polls come to mind when I think about this idea that we've consistently seen polling that shows that, more people believe that Iran possesses nuclear weapons than Israel, whereas the opposite is true. And polls out of Russia that I've seen as well that show that the majority of young people are not aware that nuclear weapons were used at the end of World War II. So the basic facts about these weapons, which threaten everyone on Earth with total destruction in the space of less than an hour, the loss of kind of a basic awareness of facts about them has been really profound, and I think really does shape our politics around them. But what that means also is that even just a little bit of learning, a little bit of political education, and just a development of an understanding of the role these weapons play in our lives and our politics can be really transformative. And that's why I would encourage people who, if you're interested in learning more about this, to look into maybe organizing a teach-in around nuclear weapons so we can start to spread awareness of how much they are at the heart of the U.S. foreign policy project of today, and how necessary it is to shift the status quo around nuclear weapons if we want to see this broader shift. Just a little bit about what Diffuse Nuclear War is working on specifically to kind of make that shift, the issues we've been pushing on. One of our main issues is to get rid of these land-based nuclear missiles. I mentioned the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, or the ICBM, which presents an especially profound vulnerability just because of the nature of the weapon itself. It basically creates the possibility of an accidental first strike at any moment. And the US is now investing billions and billions of dollars in replacing these weapons, what's called modernization, but effectively is just a replacement, which is a program that extends beyond this weapon system and is actually happening in several countries all over the world, including Russia and China. But what it's doing is locking in nuclear weapons as the basis of the sort of global political system for decades to come. And this is something we really can't afford in terms of extending this risk that nuclear weapons pose at every moment. So getting rid of those weapons that are kind of the most dangerous of a crop of, very dangerous weapons, and that even the sort of like, hawkish nuclear weapons experts would agree like are not in any sense necessary to any vision of how the US runs its nuclear establishment. is one of our sort of primary things we're pushing on. Other things we support, rejoining nuclear treaties that the U.S. has pulled out of. There's one remaining arms control treaty with Russia that's set to expire next year now. And after that, this kind of the voices that are getting louder and louder to encourage more and more aggressive arms race, um, we'll have another thing that's not limiting them. We want to end policies that allow for the first use of nuclear weapons by enacting a no first use policy, which would prevent the United States from launching its nuclear weapons first as an offensive attack, and crucially allow for changing the way it stores and uses its nuclear weapons to prevent an actual first strike. So really making that an actionable law, not just like, words. Um, Other than that, we've worked on taking nuclear weapons off of what's called hair trigger alerts. So again, making it harder to launch them at a moment's notice, making it harder to launch a nuclear weapon in response to faulty intelligence, or a false alarm of like an incoming attack, which is one of the main kind of risk factors that nuclear weapons pose. So that starting a nuclear war, for nothing. So there's a range of demands, and there's other things we're working on as well. As I said, we see this as totally integral to kind of all the struggles we're working on today. Um, and yeah, again, I just want to encourage everyone one more time to sign up for a teach-in, and to really ask the questions about how nuclear weapons work, and how they fit into our foreign policy as it is today.
Thank you, Emma Claire. We do have several questions in from the attendees. Some argue that a country should have a minimum and maximum amount of nuclear weapons. Uh, I don't know about a minimum. I would say the minimum zero would be good, but uh, a maximum number of nuclear weapons. That is a real thing, though, with treaties. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, generally a treaty that's whose goal is to limit how many and what kind of nuclear weapons a country can have does impose a kind of maximum, at least on a certain type of nuclear weapon. Um, so I mean, there's definitely like as many ideas as you can, as there are people for ways you could organize nuclear weapons if you accept that nuclear weapons should exist. But I think, a vision of how we back down from this like very bad status quo, for lack of a more complex word, would and probably involve in some steps like those kind of limits. But the goal, of course, is to ratchet them down. And I just want to emphasize that there's not like a safe number of nuclear weapons, right? The destruction that they can cause is so profound, um, and so like widespread that there's not a situation where you can sort of see, a sort of livable number of nuclear weapons. I think there's been a really effective, in certain ways, effort, especially since about 2022, to put forward this idea of like what's called a low yield nuclear weapon, where you know maybe there's like a nuclear weapon that's sort of not quite as bad as we've thought of it as, and like maybe if someone used one small nuclear weapon it
Tactical,
wouldn't
yeah.
it wouldn't escalate. But I really want to I try to push back on that, so that's just another point I think.
Yeah, and also that the United States has what, 5,000 nuclear weapons right now. Um, and so it's we could destroy the earth many times over. One more question. I have several more, but I think I only have time to get to one more. This is from Robert. He says New Zealand doesn't buy the nuclear umbrella spin. How does a nuclear umbrella work?
um well, I guess it depends on what you mean by a nuclear umbrella, but I think that there's an implication in that phrase of this kind of just in case aspect of nuclear weapons and a kind of safety that they provide, which is again something that I think it's important to push back against, right? Like having nuclear weapons is a great reason, and probably the number one reason why a country might be hit with a nuclear weapon. And ha the promises that are made about things like missile defense or about deterrence, that they can effectively and indefinitely stave off a nuclear attack for any range of reasons. And secondly, that investing more in those things, make them more effective, I think are both just totally fantastical.
All right. Thank you so much, Emma Claire. Much appreciated, as always. We're moving on to David Vine in just 1 minute. I would like to encourage everyone to go to our website, teachinnetwork.org. Someone just sent in a question and says, hey, are the speakers free? If we request a speaker, yes, the speakers are totally free. We will never charge you for anything. We're never asking for money. However, donations are fantastic, and maintaining a staff and websites, none of that is free. So we want to connect these organizations with speakers as often as we can, as much as we can, for absolutely no money. But at the same time, we are collecting donations. So if you're able to, please go to teachinnetwork.org, send us a donation. Any little bit helps. And that'll help us continue building, continue growing this, and having more teach-ins. So now we're going to move on to David Vine, writer and political anthropologist, author of the books The United States of War, Base Nation, and Island of Shame. David will focus on the dominant role of the military-industrial complex in U.S. foreign policy and the urgency of developing innovative strategies to confront war profiteers and dismantle the economic and political underpinnings of the war system. David Vine, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and really thank you for everyone in the audience, everyone watching later. This is a time of great anxiety from fires in LA to the incoming Trump administration to genocide in Gaza and far beyond. There are many things you could be doing right now. We really appreciate the chance to engage, and hopefully I'll offer something that is of some help. I do also want to thank the entire Teach-In Network and RootsAction for putting together tonight's event and the entire series. Want to thank Eric Ross in particular for his role, Bill Lockamacher, and David Swanson, of course, and others, surely behind the scenes. I want to essentially now recruit you to get involved. One of the reasons I think the Teach-In Network, the focus on foreign policy is so important is because for so long, U.S. foreign policy has been dominated by corporate interests, by capitalist interests, by the war profiteers, by the military-industrial complex, and by people who look a lot like me, typically, privileged white dudes who tend to shill for the war profiteers. We desperately need, in this particularly undemocratic realm of policy, we desperately need new people involved, new voices, new perspectives to transform the status quo. I'm here thus to recruit you to get involved in organizations like RootsAction and in movements to free ourselves from this incredibly violent, deadly status quo and from the war profiteers that have effectively hijacked U.S. foreign policy for far, far, far too long. With that, I want to share a bit of what I heard, and this builds off something that David was talking about and Ryan were talking about at the beginning. I was in Arizona leading up to the election and talking to potential voters, and I heard again and again words like, we're sick of endless US wars. We don't want World War III. We're sick of war. These were words coming from Trump voters, from independents who were likely not going to vote at all, and from a few leftists. But it was notable that these sorts of comments were coming from people across the political spectrum. And for this reason and others, I want to, above all, emphasize tonight that I think we desperately need and can build a populist anti-war movement, an explicitly, unapologetically populist anti-war movement. And I think it's one that can, given the things David was saying before, the things I heard in Arizona and for many other reasons, I think this is one that can attract people across the political spectrum and ultimately across the globe. I want to share a few thoughts about what I think a populist foreign policy could look like, but that's particularly what I would love to hear your thoughts about, and more broadly, how we are going to transform US foreign policy. As David Swanson laid out earlier, in short, US foreign policy has really since independence, but especially since World War II, been defined by a long series of catastrophic wars, as well as coups and other forms of military, political, economic meddling in other countries' affairs. A long series of catastrophic wars and other forms of military, political, economic meddling that have caused immense death and destruction. It's really, there aren't words or numbers that can capture the death and destruction that our foreign policy has caused. So what could a populist anti-war movement, a populist foreign policy look like? I want to share a few quick thoughts. I think, first and foremost, it could be a foreign policy that would demand a peace dividend. It's a foreign policy that could end war profiteering, focus on ending war profiteering and the corrupt military-industrial complex or corrupt military-industrial congressional complex that has kept us in the long series of catastrophic, deadly wars. It's a foreign policy that could be focused on building treaties, on reducing weapons production and the weapons that countries possess, as Emma was referring to. It's a foreign policy that could focus on disaster and public health response. It's a foreign policy that could put the lives and well-being of people first, rather than a real politique. It could be a foreign policy focused on a human politique. It's a foreign policy that could underline what should be common sense, that war should not be considered a legitimate policy option for the United States or any country. It's a foreign policy that could focus on renouncing war and the use of military force except to defend the borders of a nation. This may sound fantastical, naive to many. It surely does, especially given the entrenched power of the military-industrial complex that has kept the United States trapped in a long series of catastrophic, deadly wars. But I think this is a time where we can't afford a kind of self-fulfilling pessimism that would constrain our thinking. And instead, I think it's a time where we have to think as boldly and broadly as possible, to unite together with other people to build a foreign policy that works for people around the globe, a globalist even foreign policy, perhaps to reclaim that word globalist, a globalist populist foreign policy that could build on the sentiments we hear when people say we're sick of endless wars and we don't want World War III, and instead focus on building the world of peace, equity, and justice that I know the vast majority of us want to see. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, David. Very much appreciate you being here. We do have several questions for you. And thank you to the attendees for really engaging with us. You guys can see the everyone chat, but there's the Q&A chat that we can see, and then there's just the hosts and panel, and there's a lot of chat going on, and that's awesome. So thank you so much, everybody. David, first question. I want to ask you about the peace dividend first. You had mentioned that. I'm 34, so I wasn't around for when that was like maybe almost a real thing from what I've read about. How close was that to being real? And were people aware of it and looking forward to it and like then disappointed, or what happened?
In some ways, it was a real thing. It wasn't necessarily a real thing that people got in the mail the way there were, stimulus checks in the wake of or amid the COVID pandemic. But the U.S. Pentagon budget, the military budget, the war budget was cut dramatically after the end of the Cold War. And this also saw decrease in the number of U.S. military bases abroad and at home. So it is something that can happen. And when we look at, there have been few moments when movements that have sought to cut the war budget, the Pentagon budget, there have been few moments when those sorts of movements have been successful. But after the end of the Cold War, that was one moment. And I think the language of the peace dividend is one that I think could resonate with many people. Some would resonate more with the peace part, some more with the dividend part. But I think it could be an element of a populist foreign policy and populist anti-war movement that I'm alluding to or encouraging us to consider.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a totally different angle here. Can the anti-war movement succeed without confronting capitalism and imperialism, those big things?
Yes, it's a challenging question, of course. Of course, I don't have the answer. I do think, and this was sort of underlying a lot of what I was sharing, I've been working together with people in what we've called the network to dismantle the military-industrial complex. I think we need to take on the economic and political foundations of the war system, period. We can envision foreign policy all we like, and that's important. Envisioning the world we want to see, the kind of foreign policy we want to see. But we have to grapple with and take on the economic and political foundations of the war system that have kept us trapped in this long series of endless wars. And that means taking on the military-industrial complex, which is the heart of that economic political foundation. I think taking on capitalism writ large would be some laugh at, the goal of dismantling the military-industrial complex. Taking on capitalism writ large is yet another level of difficulty. So I think the focusing on the military-industrial complex, that, it's one that formed and grew over time from the days of Eisenhower to today and has grown in power and destructive power. But because it grew through a process, a series of changes, it is a process that can be reversed. It is not inevitable. It is not forever. And it's one I believe we can take on and undermine and ultimately dismantle.
Excellent. I have one more question. I'm holding you a little longer, running a couple minutes late. I want to ask you about bases because you've wrote so much about bases. I hope you can answer this question. Might be weird. What happens first, or is it if we get rid of bases, will we do less war, or do we need to start by doing less war and then we'll get rid of bases?
Both could happen, of course. But I think as David Swanson explained toward the beginning, a large collection of foreign military bases, and this is part of what I explain in my book, The United States of War, indeed make war more likely, make war an all too easy policy option for powerful people, politicians, elites of various kinds. And closing U.S. military bases abroad is a good idea for many reasons and would actually increase the security of the United States and the world. But making it harder to wage war overseas is certainly one of the reasons why it's a good and important idea. But you could, of course, imagine a world in which the United States would cease waging war. But I think closing bases abroad is an important part of a broad anti-war movement and strategy.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Much appreciated. We are going to move on now. Eric Ross, one of the organizers with RootsAction, he's going to give just a quick couple minutes about the organizing he's doing at UMass, and then we're going to go and talk to Sonali Kolhatkar. So Eric, real quick.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And I will be quick because I want to get us to our next set of expert speakers that I am incredibly grateful to have on this call, and I'm super excited to hear from. So I am an organizer with the Teach-In Network, but I'm also an organizer and a graduate student at UMass Amherst, where I chair our Graduate Worker Union's Palestine Solidarity Caucus. And I joined this Teach-In initiative because I firmly believe in the critical role Teach-Ins play in fostering community, solidarity, and education, right? Essential ingredients for mobilizing a mass movement that resists the intolerable status quo and moves us towards a more just, democratic, and less militarized world. And while high-profile direct actions often grab headlines, these actions, right, are necessary but insufficient tactics. And further, they're impossible without sustained campaigns of political education. And teach-ins form the backbone of these efforts. And make no mistake, at UMass and at other campuses around the country, right, we're winning the ideological battle on our campuses. However, corporate and political elites are betting, quite literally, that we will lose interest and momentum. But at UMass, we're countering this with a campaign of weekly teach-ins as part of a larger escalation campaign this spring. And these events are designed to sustain engagement, build collective power, and cultivate what I'm already seeing as a broader anti-imperial consciousness, right, that demands change, even as institutions increasingly, as we've seen this week, right, they declare neutrality, and those in power, looking at you, Anthony Blinken, deny the realities that we've witnessed firsthand. So at UMass, we are going to rely heavily on the experts and resources available through the Teach-In Network, and you can too. The network is here to connect you, facilitate teach-ins, and put you in touch with experts who can speak to your schools and organizations, as Ryan mentioned, at no cost on your part, right? So utilize the Teach-In Network. We are here to support you. We are here to end the madness of militarism. We are here to dismantle empire and the threat it poses to our democracy and to the world. We are here for a more just and livable world. Join us, be in touch, sign up on our website, and organize teach-ins. Together, we can create change. A better world is possible, and we can make it a reality. We must make it a reality. We will make it a reality. Thank you so much, and we'll get back to our next speakers.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you so much for all the organizing work you're doing with the Teach-In Network. It's been fantastic. Our next speaker, we are very lucky to even have joining us right now. So I want to just say thank you so much to Sonali Kolhatkar for being here. She is in the LA area dealing with the fires, so we're probably going to have some questions about that. Sonali is a journalist, host of Rising Up with Sonali, author of Rising Up, The Power of Narrative in Pursuing Racial Justice, and co-author of Bleeding Afghanistan. Sonali is going to discuss how we can create a culture that celebrates collective liberation instead of militarism. Sonali, thank you again, and take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, Ryan. And I also want to add that I'm the author of the forthcoming book. It's out next week, talking about abolition. A police-free world is possible, which is very much capturing some of the issues that I want to talk about today. And yes, I am a survivor of the Altadena Eaton fire. I live just a couple of miles from the Eaton Canyon basin, which is still blazing, and have been evacuated with my entire family. And my situation and the situation of my community, dozens of whom I personally know who've completely lost their homes, is very much part of the conversation, or should be part of the conversation, even at a panel around foreign policy. And so I don't want to talk as much policies, because many of you have done that so well, and really understand and have expressed those issues so well. I want to talk about culture shifting, because I feel that we cannot discuss ending militarism without talking about ending the culture of militarism. And we need a multi-pronged approach to culture shifting on foreign policy. The left is siloed, and I want to address the elephant in the room, right? Worrying about foreign policy is considered a privilege, and we need to acknowledge that. Those among us, or it's seen as a privilege, even if it shouldn't be, those among us who have to worry about inequity along lines of race and gender and sexuality and immigrant status, nationality, can worry about the impact of foreign policy on others outside the US. Of course, that's a myth, because in the end, it's all connected. But there's this sense that if you aren't as impacted by our domestic inequities, you can worry about foreign policy and its impact on human beings elsewhere. And I think that we have to make the links between inequities at home and those between us and others outside our homes, and have that as a pathway toward ending the culture of militarism. There's a sense that our domestic and our foreign policy are mutually exclusive, and our challenge is to link them, to make clear that we can't have nice things like a stable climate, safety, financial security, if the military wants nice things like nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, that there is an either or, right? So I think that is one of a multi-pronged approach that we need to take to changing the culture of militarism. And so I think when we talk about how domestic policy can and should be linked to foreign policy, that is a way in, that there is a pie that is fixed, and that is revenue, right? Government revenue. And the more that goes towards militarism, the more that goes towards fueling wars, the less there is for the rest of us. And I know that there's a part of the left that has historically beautifully articulated that money for for us and not for war, money for schools and not for war, money for homes and not for war. We do try to make those links, and I think those need to be re-articulated and renewed, if you will. And so understanding those links, but then also spreading this idea that when we want the financial means to have healthcare for all, it means the military needs to be cut, right? There's only so many dollars to go around. And when we make those links, those are a really great way in. If you look at the CEO killing by the suspected killer, Luigi Mangione, and the widespread outrage aimed at the healthcare private insurance industry from all sectors of the political spectrum, that is an in to talking even about foreign policy, right? Because we are told over and over again, we can't afford single-payer healthcare. Why can't we afford single-payer healthcare? Because we're busy spreading all of that money around to give to Israel to bomb Palestinians. So making those links over and over again in a way that articulates that there is only so much money, and we need to actually use it for things that help human beings, not that hurt human beings, is critical. One of the best ways that we can make such links, which I don't think has been utilized often enough, is immigrant rights. And I want to talk about that because that is another in. We have an incoming administration that has made demonizing immigrants its central focus. How do we talk about immigrant rights as an in towards foreign policy? Right now, immigrant rights is discussed in terms of if immigrants have nice things, we can't have nice things. And that's based on the dehumanization of immigrants. It relies on the otherization of immigrants. It relies on us not wanting immigrants, other human beings, to have the same things that, US-born Americans or citizens who are also human beings have. But immigrants are a way to talk about the human impacts of foreign policy. If we think of immigrants' rights in terms of human rights and articulate that again and again, and if we can explain clearly why immigrants come to the United States, often because of US foreign policy, it allows us to make those links that reject the dehumanization of immigrants, that reject the money spent on the wars that drive people to emigrate to the United States in the first place. So immigrants and talking about immigrant rights and humanizing immigrants are another way to talk about foreign policy in a way that reduces the culture of militarization. Another way that I think we need to have this culture shifting that also goes hand in hand with us being able to have safety and security is to link policing to militarization, right? Police are basically the military's equivalent of at-home soldiers. They are the armed forces that enforce racial capitalism. They are here to ensure that inequities persist. We have police only because crimes get committed. Most of our crimes are either committed from need or from mental illness, both of which could be solved by taking money out of policing and into fulfilling the needs of people and into offering people the mental health care treatment or the addiction treatment or any other kind of treatment they need, and addressing crime through a restorative justice approach. If we link militarization to policing, then the idea of defund the police extends to defund the military. Defund the police allows people to make clear that we will reject the otherization of people of color at home, who are the disproportionate victims of police, and we will reject in that same way the otherization of people abroad, who are the victims of our militarized forces. And they are parallels. And the more money we pour into policing, the less we have for education and healthcare. The more money we pour into militarization, the less we have for education and healthcare. And that is a very effective way to talk to people across the political spectrum, not not many of us do this very effectively because, again, I feel like too many on the left are siloed. Right, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we think of it as and defund the police, we think of it as a very separate issue, or even immigrant rights, we think of it as a very separate issue to the impact of US bombs on Afghanistan or US funded Israeli attacks on Palestinians, but they are absolutely linked to one another. And we can link them through talking about why Central Americans moved to the United States, why Palestinians are seeking refuge in the United States. And we can talk about them in ways that lift up the humanity and our common humanity and solidarity of communities of color at home and communities of color abroad. So having that cultural shift is so critical because it is the best way for us to have buy-in for the policies that the others of you were discussing, right? When there's a set of policies that we want a more globalist, we want a more humanistic military policy. Well, how do we have mass buy-in from Americans who are too susceptible to nativist ideologies? How do we have mass buy-in from Americans who get carried away with the MAGA, pro-working class or seemingly pro-working class sentiments? We do that by talking about how if we want nice things, the military can't have them. If we want nice things, the police can't have them. And in fact, we reduce the need for policing and military when we have nice things, making those links over and over again, allowing us to reach people all across the political spectrum. That is a way we start shifting that culture. And then when there is a congressional vote to cut off Israel's funding to Israel, there's much more public thirst for that. That buy-in is absolutely necessary. That buy-in comes from culture shifting. So I'll take questions now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonali. I've got a lot of questions. I'm really glad you talked about culture shifting because I think this is totally critical for foreign policy and the ability to connect some of these things. Right before you talked about immigration, I had immigration down, so I was happy you brought it up. I guess, like, could you maybe lay out a little bit of an example of how U.S. foreign policy towards South America, Central America, can create some of the immigration issues we see today, or a lot of the immigration issues we see?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so much history, right, between the ways in which the United States has undermined democracy in Latin America and Central America, that has essentially propped up dictators and prompted people to flee violence and war, propped up dictators who have also been pro-neoliberal capitalism, and who have fueled the kinds of domestic inequality that has pushed people to seek their fortunes north in the United States. And there's this sense, right, the saying that Latin America thrives when the United States is distracted. Latin America thrives when the US basically just forgets about it. And when the United States gets involved by propping up right-wing dictators. There's of course been a history of that going back to examples like Pinochet, all the way to more recent examples in countries like Brazil, etc. And so when we make clear the reasons why people leave their nation, that also helps us to reduce the dehumanization and the otherizing, right? Because right now, what the MAGA contingent wants us to believe is that there's hordes of immigrants coming to steal our jobs, as if they have some malicious, nefarious intent to come here and take advantage of the cushy lifestyle that they get when they come in here, which of course there's nothing that could be further from the truth, right? Immigrants take the worst jobs in the United States and also fill the biggest needs. We have a huge shortage of medical personnel, from all the way from physicians to nurses and medical technicians. Many of those jobs are filled by immigrants, not just the farm worker positions. And so that fantasy that immigrants are coming to steal our jobs and take advantage of cushy lifestyles can be undermined if we make clear the reasons why people run away and flee their homes in the first place. And it also reminds us, because every American knows an immigrant in their community. And you hear those people who voted for Trump who think, well, I want them to deport those criminal immigrants, not my neighbor Carlos, right? Who I love and who I look out for, who looks out for me. So we have to remind ourselves and keep hammering on the humanity of immigrants and the reasons why they might come here in the first place.
Thank you. I think we can only get to one more question, but I wanted to ask you about, you brought up cops as well and the policing of America. Cops are the military of our cities. You said something like that. And it's totally true. Cops are going to Israel to be trained by the IDF. How does that foreign policy decision affect the policing here at home?
Right. I mean, there's so many links between the military and the domestic police forces, right? In addition to the trainings, as you said, that the Israeli forces give cops. We also get cops and police departments around the country getting excess military weapons that the military doesn't need or use. And more we see our cops looking like military personnel when they come to protests or when they feel like they have to, put on those flak jackets and wear the face covers and carry the billy clubs. And I mean, if we look at the images from 2020 and the racial justice uprisings, it really felt like our cities were war zones where the cops were our local military forces. We don't even have to make that extension. They make it for us. They make those links for us. And just as our military enforces global neoliberal capitalism by, historically at least, and to a large extent today as well, being the enforcers of U.S. corporate interests, police are the enforcers of racial capitalism by ensuring corporate interests here. Just in California, in November, we had a ballot measure sponsored by Target and Walmart and these big corporations to increase penalties for petty theft, undoing decades of progress on reducing the population of our prisons because they are, they see police as protecting their bottom line. Instead of pouring that money into policing, we could actually pour it into reducing inequities so that people don't feel the need to resort to theft. So yes, there's such strong parallels. And if we don't make these links, I feel like we abandon our own vulnerable communities here in the United States, and it gives the left a bad name. And I really don't want that to happen, because I feel like I'm one of those people who sort of straddles both worlds, who cares about foreign policy and domestic policy and racial justice issues. And and there's not enough intersection between those of us who work on domestic racial justice issues and foreign policy justice issues.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sonali. Much appreciated. Amazing information. You brought up the racial justice uprising, the George Floyd protests where I live in Indiana, not a big city. I was shocked to see the number of military vehicles that our local police had, and to see them so excited for their first time, probably ever, to get decked out in their military gear and drive their truck around and scream at people and run people over. It was wild to see, and it was a reminder that they're getting all of these toys essentially from the military. They're wasting a lot of money on it, and then they have to give themselves a reason to use it.
Yeah, and communities of color deal with the policing of their communities every day in ways that whiter communities don't see, feel, hear, or, I write in my book about Hollywood's depiction of cops, propaganda. You can extend that to Hollywood's depiction of the military, right? Pro-military propaganda. And if you're not the one being directly affected by police and military, you really believe that they're protecting you, because often they are, but they're at the expense of the rights of vulnerable communities.
Right. Yeah. DOD has to approve scripts oftentimes that are about the military to use the shots of the whole other topic. But thank you so much, Sonali. We're a couple minutes behind, so I'm going to move on now. Our next speaker, Chris Appy, is a professor of history, the director of the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy at UMass Amherst. Professor Appy will address how foreign policy can become more democratic and less imperialistic or how it cannot become more democratic and less imperialistic until elite policymakers are challenged to relinquish their claims of American exceptionalism. Chris, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ryan, and to my co-panelists, and to everyone who set up this event, and those of you who are listening in. Yes, like Eric Ross, I'm at the University of Massachusetts, where I teach history. I've written 3 books about the U.S. war in Vietnam. Now I'm working on a book about Daniel Ellsberg, the whistleblower who in 1971 turned over to the press and the public a 7,000-page secret history of the American war in Vietnam that came to be known as the Pentagon Papers, that revealed some 2 decades of government lies about that war. And I'm also directing this Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy. So I hope you will take a look at our website. Maybe Ryan or Eric can post it in the chat. It's EIPAD.org. You can find a lot of our events recorded there. You know, many important things have to change if we are to dismantle U.S. militarism and imperialism and create a more democratic and peaceful foreign policy. Tonight, I want to focus on one thing that needs to be changed, and that is the most important of the ideological underpinnings of U.S. imperialism, which I think is American exceptionalism. Unless and until that ideology is radically undermined, really at all levels of our society, I don't think we can have substantial change in our relations with the world. For whatever else policy makers, foreign policy elite will say to explain one war or another, or one war by proxy or another, the bottom line has forever been a key tenet of American exceptionalism, which is that, as in the words of George Bush, and he's not alone, we are the greatest force for good in the world, always on the side of democracy, self-determination, human rights, and that without us and our leadership, anarchy, chaos, tyranny, instability, all these horrible things would reign supreme. Or as our current Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is constantly saying, we are on the side of a rules-based international order, as if the United States has never broken any international laws, as if we had never invaded Iraq, never waged a war of aggression in Vietnam that cost 3 million lives, or you could go back to the 19th century in our war of aggression against Mexico, countless overthrows of sovereign governments, some of them democratically elected, as in Chile in 73, Guatemala in 54, Iran in 53, or some efforts that have tried but have been failed, as with our multiple efforts to overthrow Castro in Cuba. And yet, against all this evidence, faith in American exceptionalism continues. It's sort of a puzzle as to how widespread that faith is among the American public, but I think it is maybe more widespread than we often realize, which is kind of puzzling because in one way, I think Americans can be quite self-critical if you ask them questions about specific parts of our national life. I mean, what do you think of our public schools? It gets very low grades. What do you think of our healthcare system, Congress, government in general, economic opportunities, our infrastructure? Americans can be very critical, but if you ask them, is the United States the greatest nation on earth? I think many people do still say yes. And I think given our record, that's a real problem. And within the foreign policy establishment, that faith is practically written into the job description, a condition of employment. And anybody from the inside who really challenges it seriously compromises their career. And I can't think of a major candidate for the president of the United States since World War II, with the possible exception of George McGovern, who's even hinted that we should not make it a top national priority, in the words of Kamala Harris, to be the strongest and most lethal, to have the strongest and most lethal armed forces in the world. Or think of that line uttered by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright in the Clinton years, a line she used to justify these brutal sanctions regime against Iraq. She described the United States as the indispensable nation. We stand taller, we see farther, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what does that mean? And what is the opposite of indispensable? Well, it's dispensable. And that, in effect, is sort of the way we regard the rest of the world. Think of it in personal terms. I mean, what parent would advise their child to go off to elementary school and say to them, now make sure you tell all your classmates that you are the most important, exceptional student in the class. That if you don't lead the class and tell people what to do, the whole class will fail. Well, that really is in effect how we operate in the world. And yet we actually have produced failing grades. We've lost every major war since World War II, and we failed to enrich democracy and human rights. Two of the principal claims of American exceptionalism. You might say that World War II was on the side of democracy and a just war, and there's something to that, but it has some serious asterisks. First of all, it required a massive contribution of the USSR, and it included the firebombing of some 67 Japanese cities, followed by the use of atomic weapons. So fully demonstrating that even just wars can be fought with unjust means. But as David Swanson and others have indicated, we are exceptional in some ways. We do spend more money on arms than the next 9 most militarized nations on earth combined. We lose war after war, but as Norman Solomon has written, some entities in our country never lose. I think of the big 5 military contractors: Boeing, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon. We are also exceptional in the amount of arms we sell. As merchants of death, we account for 40% of that market. We are also, as David Vine has taught us, exceptional in the number of military bases we have on foreign soil, some 800, whereas no other nation has more than a dozen or so. We are also exceptional in the number of our military interventions around the world. And each year we conduct military operations, including military training exercises, in roughly 2/3 of the world's countries. And also all of these exceptional qualities, all these exceptional manifestations of US imperialism fundamentally undermine our claims that the meaning of American exceptionalism is about promotion of democracy and self-determination. What do we do? Well, education is a part of it. We certainly have to challenge these ideological claims. We do, of course, need to try to elect people who challenge them, and we'll try in, say, Congress to assert greater oversight of the foreign policy establishment elite that is by and large completely unelected and unaccountable. So bottom-up organizing is certainly crucial. But I think we also need to recognize, reach out to, and magnify the contributions of people who have worked from the inside, who have become dissenters and whistleblowers. Daniel Ellsberg is, of course, one of them. But as he would have said, if he died a year and a half ago or so, whistleblowers don't act in a vacuum. They are inspired by others, and they in turn inspire people. Ellsberg often said that he never would have released the Pentagon Papers in 1971 if he had not been inspired by others who risked arrest or were, in fact, imprisoned in their effort to stop the war, like the some 3,200 young Americans who were imprisoned for resisting the draft, or people like the Berrigan brothers, activists in the civil rights movement, etc. So there are, the press pays scant or dismissive or even often very derisive attention, to the extent that they pay attention to whistleblowers at all. I'm thinking a lot recently of these Gaza whistleblowers. There are at least now 5 or 6 of them who have been completely ignored by the press. And on February 20th, the Ellsberg Initiative is going to have a webinar that includes 3 of these 3 US officials who resigned in protest with quite eloquent letters of resignation, public letters of resignation, in opposition to American complicity in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. briefly, just to mention their names, and you can find information and copies of their resignation letters pretty easily online. There's Harrison Mann, who was a U.S. Army major who worked for 3 years at the end of his 13 years of service with the Defense Intelligence Agency, felt incredible shame and guilt for his contribution to American foreign policy, and resigned in protest. Nell Sheline was a State Department official who resigned in March and wrote that as a representative of a government that is directly enabling the international, what the International Court of Justice had said could plausibly be a genocide in Gaza, such work has become impossible. And she also said, interestingly, in an interview on Democracy Now!, that many of her colleagues actually shared her views and were not yet themselves willing to resign, but encouraged her to speak out publicly and, in effect, speak for them. And then a third that will be involved is a man named Alexander Smith, who was a lawyer and is a lawyer and public health expert working for USAID. He was a senior advisor on gender, maternal health, child health, and nutrition. And about a year ago, he put together a PowerPoint presentation on, no, not a full year ago, more like 7 months, on conditions of women and children, medical conditions in Gaza. And his supervisors first tried to censor parts of that report that they didn't like. Then they canceled his talk altogether. And finally, they said he had to either resign or face dismissal. And he quit in protest. So I think, if we're going to educate the public on these matters, putting these stories of these inside whistleblowers is an important step, and connecting that inside critique with this bottom-up grassroots organizing campaign that everyone has been talking about, and which I too support. So I will stop there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Professor Appy. I do have a couple questions for you. We'll start with the whistleblower stuff, because that's where you ended. Love Daniel Ellsberg. Edited a film about him that you can see at diffusenuclearwar.org, about how he moved to just fighting against ICBMs and nuclear weapons. I love Daniel Ellsberg. When he was a whistleblower, or when he was whistleblowing, that's what the question is about. How much effect do you think these whistleblowers have? Are they one of our great tools for education and against militarism, or are their effects negligible and more just like cultural and like entertaining? Or are their effects real, and does it make change, or does it shift culture?
That's a huge topic, and there's a lot to say about that. I'd start by saying that in one way, whistleblowers are a sign of the weakness of our democracy, that we have to rely on people to expose lies and wrongdoing that would not otherwise be known to the public. The other thing to say is that whistleblowers would be more valuable to us if we paid attention to what the information they're disclosing, rather than debate their personalities and their integrity, or whether they were breaking the law or not. And so we as we do in America, often focus on the individual over the larger issues. But yes, I do think whistleblowers serve the public interest, can serve democracy, can serve accountability, we need to reach out to them, make connections with them, and amplify what the messages they have to share.
Right. And to your point, yeah, Assange, not a government whistleblower necessarily, but we find out what the government's doing through him, murdering people in Iraq, I think the famous video was. And the media to this day doesn't mention what it was that he exposed, only that he put
I should say too,
lives at risk.
The legal repression against whistleblowers has only gotten far worse in the decades since Ellsberg. Ellsberg was the first American criminally indicted and tried for under the Espionage Act for releasing to the press and public privileged information, not to a foreign agent or country. And in the 21st century, particularly under Obama, as it turns out, many others have not only been indicted, but done serious time, like Chelsea Manning and Daniel Hale, to name just two.
Yeah, we've worked with Thomas Drake and Jeffrey Sterling, and the Espionage Act is not something you can really fight back against either. If you get, if they say you violated the Espionage Act, that's kind of that.
Yeah.
They don't even need to show evidence.
It needs to either be abolished or radically reformed. Yeah.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Thank you, Professor Appy. Much appreciated. Let's see what time it's 9:22. We're already over our time. We'll just go to the speakers. Do any of the speakers have any final thoughts that they would like to share about U.S. foreign policy? Anything that was missed that we want to get to very quickly as we finish up here? Go ahead, David Vine.
I don't need to go first. I just wanted to turn my camera on. So if there's another speaker who has something pressing to say, please jump in.
No, I just saw your camera turn on, so I went to you. No one else stepped up. So if you have anything, go ahead. If you don't, no big deal.
Well, I did want to echo, there was a comment in the chat that I thought was very helpful, a comment about Bell Hooks's work and about gender and the role of masculinity and a particularly militarized masculinity. I think that's something I certainly failed to take on, and I think it's an important part of the picture when we think about and work toward transforming U.S. foreign policy and how the United States engages with the rest of the world. The other thing, I think I differed with David on one small thing. I think we should be, deathly fearful of what Trump and his administration may bring us. I think it is unclear what sort of a war policy he will pursue. As David, you rightly said, peace is popular, and he is many things, but he does like maintaining his popularity. So I think there is at least a possibility that we may not see as much war and violence as we might otherwise fear. At the same time, I'm deathly afraid that Trump will take us into a war with Iran, a broader war in the Middle East. So I think I'm just more, I wouldn't predict it will necessarily go in one direction or another. And I think we have to use his words against him if he goes back on his promises to not wage war, to not, if he, as well as he's promised to take on the military-industrial complex, we can use those words against him regardless of what policies he pursues.
Right. Yeah, I think the range of possibilities are greater, but doesn't make me feel good. Doesn't make me feel good because the worst is way worse. The worst is way worse. David Swanson, do you want to?
Well, I just want to respectfully disagree with David's idea that I disagree with him, because I really don't. I just think to give someone the title peace candidate, I consider that an honor that is beyond, not just out of the ballpark of any of these sadistic buffoons who are campaigning for public office in the United States government. It's just not part of the question. So, the fact that one of these monsters might, with proper public pressure and all the stars aligned, turn out not to be quite as bad as Genocide Joe, that doesn't mean I want to call him a peace candidate and support this notion that there must be the peace candidate and the war candidate. Just as in a war, there must be the good side and the bad side. This is, the rot of public thinking in the United States. My God, yes, of course, you have to push everyone to be the best you can possibly compel them to be, and encourage and applaud and condemn and denounce as merited. We'll see where it goes. I would love nothing better than for Donald Trump to turn out to be our savior, or even better for the Congress to become a legitimate operation rather than having an emperor decide things. But I just wanted to mention that one of the ways that we really need to bring home to people what foreign policy means is all of the horrific violence that we're seeing come back from the wars, in the driving of cars, in the exploding of cars, in the shooting of guns, and the absolute call it a whiteout, call it a blackout, whatever the hell you want to call it, but the absolute refusal of US corporate media outlets to touch it, to touch the fact that military veterans are very disproportionately the mass shooters. They're afraid this is, some sort of bigotry when, mass shooters are statistically nobody. Almost every veteran and almost every non-veteran is not a mass shooter. But the people who have been trained and indoctrinated in the skills of killing and the ideology of killing are very disproportionately the killers. And we have to come to terms with that and reject the outrageous absurdity of this flood of media articles about the danger of extremism penetrating the world's biggest institution of organized mass killing, about to be led by a guy who publicly shouts "kill all Muslims." It's just absurd.
Yeah, I believe military service. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's the
I will
number one
correct you. It is not a
predictor.
service.
Well, being in the military, being a person who does war, is the number one predictor of mass shootings, I believe.
Well, it's the number one predictor, according to a recent study of extremist violence of various sorts, including shootings. And it's remarkable that there have been a couple of studies that have touched on the topic. And, there is a database of mass shootings that actually dares to record who's been in the military and who hasn't, which many of them, like Mother Jones, never have and apparently never will. Any correlation is of great interest to the military. If they all had red hair, it would be, the number one story. But that they've disproportionately been trained in the very act that they're committing, but where it was a service as opposed to where it's an outrage, this is just not to be spoken of.
Right. Well, I want to thank all of our speakers who were here tonight. It was an excellent call. Thank you so much for joining the Teach-In. I want to urge everyone, go to teachinnetwork.org, sign up, get on the general update list if you just want to stay in the know. If you're ready to launch an event, request a speaker now. I've already had a couple people request speakers during this call, so that's awesome. We also received several donations during this call, so thank you so much. Let me get that. teachinnetwork.org/donate to donate so we can keep doing this. Yeah, we definitely have time for Sonali and Chris to add some final thoughts if they'd like to. Sonali or Chris, do either of you want to go ahead if you'd like to?
Sure, I'd love to
Sure.
just shamelessly plug my new book again. It's coming out next Tuesday, January 14th. It's called Talking About Abolition, A Police-Free World is Possible, out by Seven Stories Press, featuring 12 interviews, conversations with abolitionists such as Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Dylan Rodriguez and Melina Abdullah, Alicia Garza, Leah Penniman, and Gina Dent and many others. I'm really proud of it. It has a foreword by Robin D.G. Kelly, and it is a very readable, very solutions-oriented book to how we can divest from policing and invest in caring. Very relevant to our conversation today. Care not cops, invest, divest, defund the police / defund the military. So check it out, Talking About Abolition. Support your indie bookstore when you buy it. Thanks.
Thank you, Sonali. Chris, any last words, final words?
Yeah, just that the Ellsberg Initiative is really trying to work on creating wider spread understanding of the ways in which the existential threats we're facing are interconnected. So we've done quite a bit of programming on not just climate change, but nuclear weapons and the ways in which they overlap, along with militarism. That's really it. Thanks so much for putting it together.
Thank you so much, Chris. I wrote an article a couple years ago about how climate change is was it nuclear winter is climate change and fast forward. So yeah, the connections are very clear there.
On steroids. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And then I guess to close it all out, for the David Vine and David Swanson's last conversation, I think we can all agree that Trump isn't for peace, but people thinking a candidate is a big advantage. And if we can convince all of our candidates to run on peace and get them to understand that peace is popular, we all win. So With that, thank you all for being here. Thank you to our speakers, and we will see you next time. Until then, go to teachinnetwork.org and get involved. Thank you.